Hello, everyone. Welcome to the third. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Welcome to the third day of our conference, international conference on the on migration, diasporas, and the sustainable development. I welcome you all to this session, which is on the migrant diaspora organization, civil society, and human rights. Let me introduce you our distinguished chair, Dr. Didar Singh, who is a former Indian civil servant and former Secretary General of the Federation of Indian Chambers of Commerce and Industry. He graduated from the University of Birmingham with a master's degree in development administration in 1996. In addition, he holds a PhD on the policy and administration of e-commerce from Punjab University, Chandigarh. He is an alumnus of St. Stephen's College, Delhi. Singh was appointed Secretary General of the Federation of Indian Chambers of the.
I think, Ani, that's enough. You're wasting too much time. That's enough.
Okay, sir. Then now we have some 7 to 8 presenters. These papers. Okay, the first one will be Indian Migrant Association's Host and Home Country Engagement. Lessons from the cantons of Geneva and Vaud, Switzerland, to be presented by Dr. Victoria Castillo Rueda. The second one is the Inter-American Human Rights System in the Context of Migration, U.S. Migration Policies, to be presented by Ms. Mayra Delegado Lawrence. And the next one is a Transnational Perspective on the Japanese-Brazilian Community Organization by Ms. Rika Shandola. And the Spoils of Partition, Forced Migration, and the Prevailing Colonial Hangover by Ms. Mayurakshi Ganguly. The next one will be Indian diaspora organizations in Singapore and their role in promoting community integration, to be presented by Ms. Aparna Tripathi. And the next one, Undermined by Pandemic, Migrants in Informal Sector in Durban, by Miss Oyevo Adetola Elizabeth and Umo Samuel Uwem. And the next one, Invisible Among the Invisible, Women, Migrants, Workers and State Apathy by Aishwarya Bhuta. And finally, the last one, The Impact of COVID-19 Pandemic on Xenophobic Political Discourses in the Global West, to be presented by Dr. Elif Chatin. So welcome you all. Sir, now I will hand over it to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ms. Yerman. This is a fascinating conference that is actually being organized, and I actually compliment all the organizers for the really getting together some very, very interesting topics. And I must compliment all the panelists because they have presented superb papers. In fact, Ani has just read out all the 8 presenters and the papers that they have done. In fact, the conference people have got together a souvenir in which extracts of each paper is available. I would strongly recommend that some of the participants see this and actually read those papers because they're really quite excellent. In today's discussion, of course, we are talking about civil rights, we are talking about organizations, we are talking about human rights. Now, this is a very, very important aspect of the whole diaspora and migration debate and has been looked at from many, many different ways. I'll just make some 2-3 very basic points, and then of course we'll get into the presentations, and then there's a chance for question and answer, and then there is also a summing up at the end of the whole session. We've got about almost 2 hours there, so I'm going to request each panelist to try and keep to about 10 to 12 minutes so that we can manage to finish all the presenters and then get into Q&A as may be required for this session. The few points that I want to make are really generic in nature about the entire migration and diaspora debate. The single most important feature that we need to look at even right now is deglobalization that is actually happening. We saw 70 years of globalization where migration and mobility were a very essential feature of human development. And now suddenly we are seeing a lot of countries go back on it. And we see a lot of countries, they are now not wanting to recognize the importance of mobility, not wanting to recognize the importance of migration, and have actually closed up their borders around the world. But this is something which goes contrary to the very fact of the contribution that diaspora are making in the same countries. And we're seeing this right now in the US, where, say, for example, the Indian diaspora is playing a very important role in the election which is going on right now in the US. So, this deglobalization that I'm talking about and the protectionism is something which is a feature of life. The second thing that we need to understand is that we have right now, and there are some papers on it in this conference being circulated, we're in the middle of this pandemic. And the pandemic is having a tremendous impact on all aspects of human development and all aspects of economic connectivity. And in that, migrants are suffering. Why? Because the marginalized always get hit the first. This is something that you're going to see across the board. So whether it is a gender issue, whether it's the issue of children, whether it is the issue of informal work, these are the marginalized communities that will first get hit. And we're seeing this happen in the COVID-19 that is looking to destroy economies around the world. This is leading to a lot of return migration. I myself have done a lot of work on return migration, and you will see that in India, where we are seeing a large number of return migrants from the Gulf, for example, and several state governments are trying to handle this in a manner most conducive to both human rights as well as the individual national rights of the people who are returning. There is, of course, the whole issue of migration and development debate. We are all aware of it. I don't want to get into too much detail. That's come out in the conference very clearly. But in that, the single most important last thoughts that I would like to leave you with, and this is something that each of the presenters will hopefully do more research work on, is the impact of technology on migration. That is something that we don't normally talk about, but in the future, technology will have a tremendous impact on all jobs and all mobility and all development and all economic activity. So with that, I stop my discussions at this point, and I open now to the first of the presenters. We have from Geneva, from the land which gives us, of course, a very, very fabulous wine also. You have a very important presentation by the Andean Migrant Association and Home Country Engagement Lessons from the Cantons of Geneva and Vaud in Switzerland, Dr. Victoria Castillo. May I request Victoria to kindly make her presentation now. Thank you very much. Where is Victoria?
It seems she's not here. Hello.
Oh, if Victoria is not here, then let's move to number 2. Number 2 is Maria Lorenz, Inter-American Human Rights System in the Context of Migration, U.S. Immigration Policies. Is Ms. Lorenz available?
Yes, sir, here.
Please go right ahead.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity to share this space with all of you. I'll be talking about the Inter-American Human Rights System in the context of U.S. immigration policies. And the question that I want to answer is whether thematic hearings, which are a tool offered by the Inter-American system, are effective at encouraging changes in U.S. immigration policies that violate migrants and refugees' human rights. I'll begin by talking about the context in which I'm looking at the data to answer this question, a context that discusses the history of the Inter-American system, the relationship between human rights and sovereignty, and the role of the US in this context. Then I will briefly explain my methods and what I have found so far. In the past few years, the US government has put in place immigration policies that violate migrants and asylum seekers' human rights. And domestic protection systems are not being effective at recognizing and protecting those rights. In part, this is because immigration became a very politicized issue that was coupled with an abrasive hate rhetoric emanating from the US government. And I found that some NGOs are using the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, specifically its thematic hearings, to denounce those policies. But it's important to understand the complexity of advocating for human rights within the transnational migration context, because human rights protections are tied to the notion of sovereignty. States are, quote unquote, obligated to ensure human rights protections for their citizens. But whose obligation is it to protect the human rights of individuals who are migrating transnationally? So let's explore the Inter-American human rights system first. The system was created by the Organization of the American States, and it has two main organs: the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, which is guided by the American Declaration on the Rights and Duties of Men. And this is a non-binding instrument and has been signed by all 35 member states in the Americas. And then we have the Inter-American Court on Human Rights, guided by the American Convention on Human Rights, which is a binding document, but has only been signed by some Latin American states. Neither the US nor Canada have signed that convention. Here, I want to highlight two important factors that relate to the effectiveness of thematic hearings. First, in terms of competence, only the Inter-American Commission has competence to hold hearings that involve the US. But whatever decision the Commission makes is only taken as a recommendation because it is guided by a non-binding instrument. And the Inter-American Court doesn't have competence because the US hasn't ratified the American Convention. Second, there is a clash between human rights and sovereignty from the very foundation of the Inter-American system. Why? Because the mission of the Inter-American system is to promote and protect human rights in the American hemisphere. But the system is part of the Organization of the American States, which was created for the protection of sovereignty and territorial independence and integrity. And when we talk about protecting sovereignty, we're talking about protecting citizens rather than human beings. And therefore, in the context of migration, when advocating for the protection of migrants' human rights, once they are in countries other than their countries of citizenship, sovereignty becomes a barrier, and more so when the only regional organization that can be used to advocate for those protections is guided by a non-binding instrument. So the US is exploiting the notion of sovereignty to justify unfair policies, extreme border securitization, and the extension of its borders in complete disregard of migrants and asylum seekers' human rights. The question then is, why was the US so embedded in creating a system that it was going to completely disregard? And I found that there are scholars who argue that the Inter-American system serves two purposes. One, the promotion of Western ideologies in Latin American countries, and the policing through the veil of human rights protections of countries that have less power and resources to defend their independence and sovereignty. And this is evident when one looks at the Inter-American system's history. The system received the support of Latin American countries because it aimed to put a stop to US interventionism. However, the United States controlled the political organs of the Organization of American States and defined the priorities of the Commission from the very beginning. And many scholars in Latin America have discussed how the US used the Commission to advance its interventionist agenda under the pretense that it needed to contain the spread of communism in Latin American countries and protect people's human rights. So going back to the main question, can thematic hearings be effective at motivating changes in US immigration policies within this context? To answer this question, I use two methods: qualitative content analysis and participatory observation. And the data that I analyzed support existing scholarship in regards to the Inter-American system being a policing system for Latin American countries. And unfortunately, the data also suggests that civil society organizations that engage with the Inter-American system are actually legitimizing and contributing to the US agenda, putting into question whether this can actually lead to policy change. For example, I look at the Commission's historical records on its website, and I found that from 25 countries that have had commissioners in the Inter-American system, the country with the larger number of commissioners over a period of 61 years is the United States with 10 commissioners. Well, the countries that the US has impacted the most with its interventionist measures and immigration policies have had many less commissioners. We have Mexico and El Salvador, which with 4 commissioners, Guatemala 3, Honduras has only had 1 commissioner. Additionally, the US has had commissioners for 56 years out of the 61 years the commission has been in place, while Mexico has had commissioners for 37 years, El Salvador for 21, Guatemala for 9, and Honduras for 8. So as you can see, the US has been highly engaged with the Inter-American system. Yet, when I look at the historical records of thematic hearings that were related to migration and that were regional in nature or directly involved the US, I found that 42% of those hearings were about claims of human rights violations by the United States. So in the context of migration in the Americas, you have the most powerful country in the region, highly involved with a system supposedly designed to protect human rights, while at the same time, that same country is the most charged with human rights violations. How can thematic hearings, and in fact, any tool from the Inter-American system, motivate immigration policy change in the US? My final point is that the data that I looked at suggests that the Inter-American human rights system is not designed to be accessible to those directly affected by government's actions. This historical context analysis and the data collected suggests that it's more of a top-down system created by a Western power to police the less powerful countries in the region. In that context, it is not likely that thematic hearings will be effective at motivating changes in the US immigration policies. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maria. That was really, really interesting, and your knowledge about the entire human rights situation, and that too prevailing in the US and in America, so to speak, is really tremendous, and compliments on it. I do hope that the points that you're making will be looked at by people in the policy world, and we'll look at it, but I have my doubts. Thank you very much for that. May I now return to Richa Shandola. She is going to talk to us also. Is Richa there? Yes, thank you very much, Richa. You're right there. Please go right ahead. Explain your background and then tell us about your paper.
Very good evening to everyone, and good morning to our friends in the Americas. My name is Richa Shandola, and I'm a doctoral candidate at Center for Latin American Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. And I also like to thank our chair, Dr. Didar Singh, for inviting me to present my paper at this forum. My paper is basically on the Japanese Brazilian or the Nipo Brasileiro community in Brazil. And I primarily focus on the community organizations of the Nipo Brasileiros and how they help in the facilitation of transnational networks between Japan and Brazil, and help in the construction of hybrid identities and cultures amongst the community members. So at the outset, I'll talk a little bit about how the community was formed, how it came into being. The Japanese immigration started to Brazil started in 1908. As we know, under the Meiji rule, the Japanese government did follow a policy of immigration, and their primary destinations included US, Canada, Mexico, other countries in Spanish America. However, with the growing Japanese militarism and the rise of this notion of yellow peril, threat of the yellow peril, Brazil emerged as an alternative destination for Japanese immigrants. Brazil always was looking for sources of labor to work in the large plantations or the latifundias that were the mainstay of the economy at that time, and which required a steady source of cheap labor for its upkeep. So at the time, the state of Sao Paulo signed an agreement with the Japan-based immigration company, also sponsored by the Japanese state. And Sao Paulo, the port of Santos, was the first place to receive Japanese immigrants in Brazil. Now their number in Brazil rose up till before the Second World War. Around 300,000 Japanese migrated to Brazil. And initially they worked as contract labor in the plantations. However, the conditions there were quite horrible, and soon they left the, I'm sorry, a dog is barking outside. Soon they left the plantations and they formed their own colonias based on a Japanese style society in hinterlands in Brazil, in states like primarily Sao Paulo, but also Parana and Amazonas. And these colonias were sometimes founded by pioneer migrants, but oftentimes, and especially the larger ones, they were funded by the Japanese state. And also the Japanese consulate or Japanese agents, or maybe agents from Japanese immigration companies, were heavily involved in regulating the life inside the Japanese colonias. There were Japanese language schools, publications, Japanese clubs. There was a loyalty to the emperor and to the homeland that was promoted. And this continued for a while. However, around the period of the Second World War, there were rising restrictions, and this period also coincided with the rise of Vargas in Brazil and his Brasildade campaign. Around this time, restrictions started from 1931 itself, but by 1938, almost all Japanese language papers, schools, etc. in Brazil had been banned, and also the use of Japanese language in public was banned. Soon, Brazil also joined the war against Japan with the Allies. And at that time, diplomatic relations with Japan were totally cut off. The consulate was shut overnight, and most of the staff left the country. Now, here the Japanese community in Brazil found themselves quite isolated because, and most of them still maintain loyalty towards Japan. In fact, after Japan's defeat in the war, there was a split in the community, and one large faction refused to believe in Japan's defeat in the war and even perpetrated terrorist attacks against those Nipo Brasileiro who accepted Japan's defeat. However, within a few years, like, it was undeniable that Japan had lost the war, and also being cut off from the Japanese consulate, these Japanese migrants, this Japanese diaspora in Brazil, they started Brazilianizing. This was also a phase of rapid industrialization, urbanization in Brazil, and the Japanese also had placed a lot of value on the education of their children. So as the colonias became successful, or they had the means, most send their children, or the second generation, to study in urban areas in Sao Paulo and other states. And many of the second generation Naisei, they became professionals and did quite well for themselves. They climbed up the socioeconomic ladder in Brazil. And along with that, there was more integration in Brazilian society. The Japanese language was lost in most of the second and third generation. There was high rate of inter-ethnic marriage as well. And now they sort of downplayed their Japanese identity and accepted their status as Brazilian citizens. However, with the 1980s and the economic crisis in Brazil, like in other countries, it's considered the lost decade in Latin America. Even the well-to-do Japanese Brazilians, they faced loss of income, loss of jobs. And around this period, a pattern of circular migration was observed, wherein many Nipo Brasileiros migrated to Japan to work as unskilled factory labor in the manufacturing industry there, especially the automobile manufacturing industry in places like Hamamatsu, Tokyo, Shizuoka, Aichi, etc., and several other places. At one point, this migration actually increased after 1990s because the Japanese government introduced a new visa category that allowed, called Taijushe, that allowed Japanese descendants about the third generation or the Nikkei diaspora, the Japanese diaspora, also called Nikkei, to come back to Japan, and not back really because many of them were first-time migrants to Japan, but to work as unskilled migrant workers in Japan for a short period of time. So this kind of temporary labor migration from Latin America to Japan started. There was a huge influx of Latin American Nikkei and especially Brazilian Nikkei in Japan. And this peaked around 2004, 2005, where almost 20% of the community strength was found in Japan. So the community was thus spatially fragmented between Japan and Brazil. And during this time, it is that the role of the organizations, the community organizations, helped in the maintenance of networks that connected the migrants with their kin back home. This was called a dekaseki labor migration, or a temporary labor migration. However, with time, like the Nipo Brasileiros began to settle in Japan, at the same time, they also faced discrimination from the Japanese, although they were their co-ethnics, but the cultural differences were very vast. And Nipo Brasileiro clusters came up in many places in Japan, where they would display a deterritorialized Brazilian nationalism with the Brazilian national flag, colors, cuisine. They even organized samba and carnival in even places like Tokyo. So this was, they kind of asserted their Brazilian identity while in Japan. However, while they were sending financial remittances, huge financial remittances back to Brazil, there was also a flow of social remittances back to Brazil. And the Nipo Brasileiro community in Brazil, they had sort of an awakening of their Japanese identity, a Japanese culture. Japanese language classes became popular amongst the community members there. And all this, in a large part, was facilitated by transnational collaborations entered into by the community organizations. Now, here I would like to mention three important organizations. One is the Bankyo, which is a Nipo Brasileiro community cultural organization, which has existed for many decades now, since the 1950s. Then there is Kendren, which is a federation of provincial associations, but here it is based on the Japanese prefecture from where the members trace their ancestral lineage. So it connects Nipo Brasileiro in Brazil to their respective ancestral prefecture in Japan. And both of these organizations, they have a lot basically they are cultural organizations and help in cultural exchange between Japan and Brazil, but they also facilitate movement between Japan and Brazil. Like they have several scholarship programs, internship programs, placement programs. So they help in the flow of bringing familiarity to the Nipo Brasileiro about Japanese culture. At the same time, they also collaborate with Japanese entities like JICA, the Japan International Cooperation Agency, the Nippon Foundation, other organizations working for the Dekasegi migrant workers in Japan. And through this, they facilitate not just financial remittances that come back to Brazil, but also cultural influences. And one more important organization specifically to do with the Dekaseki, the labor migration is the CIETE, which was formed in 1992 specifically for aspiring Dekasegi migrants. It gives them guidance about what to expect in Japan, how to make a move. It also educates them about Japanese cultural and social customs. So these three organizations, I feel, played a major role in facilitating not just migration, but also the flow of culture between both the countries, and helped in maintain the transnational networks linking the community, which is now spatially fragmented between two countries. Finally, I would like to say that although the role of state in this particular migration between Japan and Brazil is very important, but the state has often used the community's organizations as a way to bring interest to the subject of migration and facilitate this migration to make up for the shortage of unskilled labor in Japan. With this, I'll end my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Richa. That was absolutely excellent. And the fact to have an Indian who's researching Japanese migrants in Brazil, I mean, that's really very special. Like, God knows how you get the data and are able to interpret that data. That's really, as a PhD scholar, I guess that's a big one.
It's a lot of work, yeah.
A lot of work. Well, anyway, thank you very much, and we'll ask you some questions later. Incidentally, about the questions, may I just make it clear to all the participants, if you have any questions for any of the participants and panelists, please put them on the chat group. Please put your question on the chat group. We'll pick it up from there and then ask it during the Q&A session that is going to follow all the presentations. We now move to Ms. Ganguly. I think you're there. Ms. Ganguly. Yes, thank you very much. You have a very interesting topic about decolonization and stuff like that. Let's hear something about that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. And this is Mayurakshi Ganguly, and I thank everyone for being a part of such an esteemed conversation. I would not like to waste much time, and I'll just go to my paper directly, which is about the spoils of partition, forced migration, and the prevailing colonial hangover. So I would directly read out my paper, so it will be nice for you, I guess. At the stroke of midnight, when India woke to freedom, it was with a terrible cost. Attlee's statement of 3rd June allocated the partition of India, which in turn would bring atrocities upon the divided wings of Punjab and Bengal. The British election of 1945, following World War II, had outcast Churchill against popular belief. Otherwise, India would have been a dominion status, as he writes to the Prime Minister Attlee in one of his letters. I'm worried to hear that you'll call the India Bill the Indian Independence Bill. This is completely against what we'd been told before. The only reason why I gave support to plans agreed with Mountbatten is because they'd established dominion status. Partition may have seemed to be the only option, keeping in mind the provocations of the Indian leaders, but this historic step would immediately give rise to utter confusion and anarchy, resulting in the dislocation of a large mass of people based solely on their religion or beliefs. People with a very definitive plot of land they deemed as Desh or country were quickly accommodated in ideas concerning the bigger picture, nationalism, which was unheard of in their community. In Tarashankar Bandyopadhyay's regional novel Ganodevata, Debu Master is moved by the socialist ideologies of the young boy from Kolkata who has been kept under house arrest in Shivkalipur. The author denotes how different are the outlooks of people belonging to various segments of the society. While Debu gives up his wife's jewelry to meet the necessities of his people, Chirupal doesn't wink before mending a broken wall, incorporating an inch or more every time from his neighbor's property. Here, the difference is profound in regard to the materialistic want of the characters. Thus, the novel ends in finding the Ganodevata or the people's leader in Debu Master. As Orwell writes in his essay, Shooting an Elephant, and it was at this moment, as I stood there with the rifle in my hands, that I first grasped the hollowness, the futility of the white man's dominion in the East. Here was I, the white man with his gun, standing in front of the unarmed native crowd, seemingly the leading actor of the piece. But in reality, I was only an absurd puppet, pushed to and fro at the will of those yellow faces behind. India's history has been that of a gradual accumulation of different invading cultures, but never in retrospective can we trace such an orchestrated way of deconstructing one's tutelage as done by the British. Even before the forced exodus of the laborers, Indians had trade routes set up all along the Chinese or Persian settlements in the north. The scope of diaspora, the longing for home, was present before the forceful displacements of the laborers during the colonial era. But we fail to find any written records of those traveling accounts. Why is it always a white man's burden that he needs to think for the betterment of the world? Orwell, who was against British imperialism and was very much vocal about it, was neglected all his life, even sent off to remote areas infested with diseases, to which he gradually succumbed at a very ripe age of his discourse, ensuring us the fate of any revolutionary writer. In David Dacius's A Critical History of English Literature, he quotes about the Anglo-Saxons. Through the Romans, whose world they threatened and finally overcame, they were barbarians, appearing out of nowhere to endanger with their primitive, vigor, and alien ways of thought both the political structure of the empire and the ideological thought of Greco-Roman ideological structure of Greco-Roman thought, which is quite similar to what Churchill felt about the Indian mass, whom he actually deemed to be a heathen lot of people with heroic ideas, yet there was the will to rule over them, to make them a better contraband for shipment. In Mulk Raj Anand's Coolie, we find the protagonist Munu making an interstate journey until he reaches his final destination through slow death by a chronic illness. His mistress is sympathetic but unable to retrieve him from his plight, just like Mrs. Moore cannot save Dr. Aziz in E.M. Foster's A Passage Through India. Her hands are tied by her own son, who is a trained official of the British Raj. While in British writings related to India, we come across a section of people advocating the cause of the colonized, the sense is completely different in the writings of diasporic authors of Indian origin. As post-colonial critic and sociologist, Avtar Bra states, home is a mythical place in diasporic literature. In this sense, it becomes a place where no return is possible. Even if it is possible to revisit the geographical territory, the affectation attached to it gets lost somewhere. In V.S. Naipaul's A Free State, the author builds up two supportive narratives to elude the nostalgia felt by his characters, yet a hope for a better world grasps them eventually. Salman Rushdie, on the other hand, creates a utopian narrative while connecting the real historic events in Midnight's Children. The author's search of a solution for this mystified state of frantic in his motherland and Salim's search for his identity are but one. Indian diaspora is the second largest after the Chinese. There are at least 26 million Indians living in diaspora today. What makes them a diasporic community is nothing but home consciousness or the longing they curate in their hearts for their motherland. Yet the land they are presently at is also their home, and there is a sense of responsibility towards it. You don't understand, Shantosh. Bombay is Bombay. This is an extract from A Free State by V.S. Naipaul. He says the employer, talks to his, the employed, and he says, you don't understand, Shantosh. Bombay is Bombay. Here, if we start living in cupboards, we give the wrong impression. They will think we all live in cupboards in Bombay. There is a constant urge to set a genuine impression in the eyes of the foreign employers. But in turn, there is no need to be absolutely just with your Indian employee, because as poor as they really are, little do they know of the ways of the world. Anyway, this home consciousness leads to either a hybrid or hyphenated identity amongst diasporic Indians, leading them to search for their roots, and this is what they write about. So the history of Indian diaspora can be largely divided into three groups: pre-colonial diaspora, colonial diaspora, and post-colonial diaspora. Pre-colonial diaspora is what we can say as Indians have a long history as traders, travelers, or they have travel routes alongside the Central Europe and China, Central Asia, Northwestern India, and places like Sri Lanka, Burma. So it was not very much different to these people. Like they knew the feeling before they even went away forcefully. Available Indian diasporic literature written in English starts with those who voluntarily or involuntarily migrated during the British colonization of India. The Indian diaspora of the colonial era began with the end of legal slavery in the early 1830s. This resulted in the recruitment of indentured laborers from various parts of India to be sent as minor wage workers to fill in the gaps of the labor markets in the outer British colonies. As a result, from the 1830s to the 1920s, over 1 million Indians were displaced all over the globe, from the islands of the African coast, such as Mauritius and Seychelles, to South and East Africa, to Caribbean islands, to Burma, Malay, Singapore, and Fiji. Once they had crossed the Kalapani, they were discarded by fellow Indians for caste taboos and untouchability, therefore pushing them farther away from their home to a point of no return. Thus, in their indentured period, they stayed back and made this new acquired land their home. The indentured labor settlements led to the need for Indian traders and professionals to meet the daily requirements of those who had stayed back in these new pieces of land after their contract was over. Just like Gandhiji, he was also a recruit from India, who had first gone in 1893 to NATO, South Africa, as a lawyer to an Indian businessman of Gujarati origin. Gandhi had returned to India on the persuasions of the then Congress leaders on 9th of January 1915, which is till day celebrated as Pravashi Divas by the Indian government. So this was the newly independent, this was a tradition at that point. So the newly independent nation state had a lot to deal with at the moment, ranging from political aggression to building of a new constitution, whereas the war-torn British, on the other hand, had suffered a loss of laborers and low-wage workers. Richard Cox, the founder of Cox and Kings, a Europe-based travel organization, first started his business with the recruitment of laborers from poorer parts of India and Africa, and once British colonized countries. As we now know, the esteemed travelers group of the same name is of the above origin, and it is not that difficult for us to grasp their role in the recent 2019 tourist scam in India. So back in the 30s and the 40s, skilled and semi-skilled laborers and transport workers from India migrated to UK. With the introduction of the welfare state by the Labour government, Britain also called from India doctors, nurses, lawyers, teachers, and engineers. This laborer and professional diaspora was followed by the post-colonial and entrepreneurial and academic diaspora in the United Kingdom. Later,
You're going to try and finish in about 2 minutes, if you could. Thank you.
Sure. I will. So there are many things to say, and if I can quote Madhusudhan Datto, a Bengali poet, he wrote once, "To cross the great Atlantic wave for glory or a nameless grave," which means there is an urge to go and have an impression set on the other community rather than being here and being present at the moment and taking responsibility of your own situation and your own country. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Excellent, Rukshi. That was really, really very interesting. It's the first time I'm seeing a direct connection between the colonial period and looking at it as a diaspora context. I have a suggestion for you, actually, which of course we can look at during Q&A. You might want to look at human rights before colonial period and after colonial period. Is there a difference, and how does it impact the Indian diaspora? Okay, wonderful. That was really nice by my Mayukshri. Ganguly. I will now. Is Victoria back by any chance? Victoria, we missed you in the beginning. Is Victoria back? No, she's not. So we now switch to Arpana Tripathi, please. Is she there? Yes, Arpana. Thank you very much.
Yes,
go
sir.
right ahead. Please go right ahead. Thank you.
Okay, sir. Thank you, sir. Thank you so much. Good evening to everyone. My name is Aparna Tripathi. I am doctoral fellow at Center for Diaspora Studies, Central University of Gujarat. My MPhil topic was based on Indian diaspora in Singapore as a soft power in bilateral relations. So here I am presenting the topic Indian diaspora organizations in Singapore and their role in promoting community integration. In this article, I am going to briefly discuss that how and in what ways these organizations promoting community integration in Singapore. So, Indian diaspora consists 9% of the entire population of Singapore. India and Singapore have a history of long-standing mutual relations, which can be seen through from Ashoka's period to till now. Indian migration in Singapore constructed from various communities consisting of low-grade workers, merchants, and vendors. But in present, major migrants are IT professionals, businessmen, and students. Singapore is a multicultural state. That is why Indians and other migrant community enjoys their cultural freedom, and they have been assimilated very well in Singaporean society. They are also very well connected with their roots and Indianness. So before starting the role of Indian diaspora organization in promoting community integration, I just want to explain integration within 2-3 lines. So integration is a sociological context, refers to stable cooperative relations within a clearly defined social system. Integration can also be viewed as a process that of strengthening relationships within a social system and of introducing new actors and groups into the system and its institutions. The integration of immigrants is primarily a process. If this process succeeds, the society is said to be integrated. So, for seeing the role of Indian diaspora organizations promoting and community integration, we have to look the name of diaspora organization who are working there. So, in this regard, there are so many Indian organizations in Singapore, like Singapore Indian Association, established in 1923, Singapore Indian Development Association, established in 1991, and some religious Indian organizations are also there, like Hindu Endowment Board, Central Sikh Gurdwara Board, SAIF Church for South Asian Community, Arya Samaj Jain Religious Society, Bangla Language and Literary Society, Odia Society, Telangana Culture Society, etc. Many are community-based organizations like Malayali, Tamils, Kannada, Punjabis, Gujarati, etc. So these organizations promoting community organizations in many ways. So I will discuss that in what ways they are promoting community integration. Like they organize programs to support the funding and running of ethnic small businesses. Such support could include counseling for startup initiative in legal affairs, tax issues, and financial and organizational matters, as well as assisting with access to enterprise support programs. There has been some improvement in education for the second generation of migrants compared to the first generation. Hello, am I audible? Hello, 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 am I audible? Hello.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much.
We can hear you.
Thank you, ma'am. There has been some improvement in education for the second generation of migrants compared to the first generation. Reason of this is these Indian organizations. They support Indian migrants in language training, support from immigrants' culture, negotiating support from religious practices, and support for sporting activities and many other cultural activities. These organizations are crucial to live lives of immigrants and their families and their communities. They act as community centers where newcomers can be among others who speak their language and where they can learn to navigate their life in the host country. They are safe places where second and third generation immigrants can learn about their ethnic culture, their Indian culture. So these centers also double as social services providers, uh, especially in places that are not so welcoming, where immigrants don't have to access to health and other social services. Immigrant non-profits also act as advocates and representatives and promote the civic and political engagement of newcomers. They serve as channels through which funders, government agencies, and elected officials can reach immigrants. So these organizations also help individuals and their families find a community, achieve economic stability and self-sufficiency, and learn and participate in a social and political system and become legal residents or citizens. They often serve as a link or bridge between community members, between Indian diaspora and the host countries. These groups are often small with little or no financing, relying on a small number of volunteers. Some are isolated from other groups in the voluntary sector, while others develop partnerships. They are a very important part of the community support structures, as they often are the only or primary support for community members who are otherwise isolated. So to conclude, I want to say that the value of the social and cultural Indian organizations in Singapore is further clarified by the concept of social capital. Social capital refers to the connection between individuals. In particular, social capital refers to the social networks and patterns of reciprocity and trust which flow from such connections. Societies which have high level of interpersonal trust, network and social norms have a higher potential for social, political, economic development than those which do not have those characteristics. So these ethnocultural organizations through their activities play a key role in the development and support of social capital. They offer informal link for cohesion and mutual help, with increase the sense of belonging and of being supported. They also enable their members to have access to external networks which can help them change their situation, like for migrants, they help with them to find employment or housing. In other words, ethnocultural organizations do important work for integration, inclusion, and participation of new immigrants in the Singaporean society. Thank you. Thank you very much. Hello.
Sir, please unmute yourself. You're muted.
Okay, it was the tab is supposed to work, but it wasn't working. Anyway, thank you, Aparna. You did an excellent job, and you've done it in less than 10 minutes. So congratulations to you. And I'll have a question for you after we finish. But let's get on to the next person here. We have Elizabeth from South Africa. Is she there? Is Elizabeth there? Elizabeth is not there. Should we then look at Ashwarya Bhuta? Ashwarya is there?
Yes, sir, I'm here.
Wonderful. Then Ashwarya, why don't you carry on with your presentation? Thank you.
Yes, sir, absolutely, sir. Yes. Just a moment. I'm sharing my screen. Is the screen visible, sir?
Yes, it is.
All right, sir. Thank you. A very good evening to the respected chair, members of the organizing committee, presenters, and all the attendees. Thank you for providing me this opportunity to present my paper titled Invisible Among the Invisible, Women, Migrant Workers, and State Apathy. I'm trying to turn on the slideshow. Please give me just a moment till I do that. So, yeah.
Go here. Go right to the bottom.
All right. Okay. Thank you. The COVID-19 pandemic has taken a massive toll on lives as well as livelihoods. In India, the lockdown announced at a 4-hour notice brought nearly all economic activities to a staggering halt. Migrant workers faced the prospect of forced expulsion from cities. With no work and no home to go to, stranded migrants began walking or cycling for miles together in the scorching heat. Visuals such as these became viral. The hitherto invisible migrant workers became hypervisible on highways and streets, on bus stands, and on railway stations. What unfolded was massive reverse migration, also considered to be one of the largest exoduses in human history. Amidst the returning crowds were single or pregnant women, those with young children, and those suffering from pre-existing medical conditions and disabilities. The migrant workers became visible, but not the women among them. The gendered aspects of migration have been overlooked. This paper makes a strong case for gender sensitivity. It is an attempt to initiate a discussion around the problems faced by female labor migrants during the pandemic. It questions the conspicuous absence of women from migration discourses, social dialogue, and policy making. More importantly, it demands greater accountability of the state towards some of its most marginalized and exploited citizens, the invisible yet significant female labor migrants. Pandemics tend to affect women and men differently. Alongside gender-based violence and discrimination, women are often victims of multiple oppressions resulting from caste, religion, race and ethnicity, or disability. Female migrants in the informal sector face greater vulnerability, compounded by exclusion from social insurance. Economic impact of the lockdown is disproportionately higher on women due to their concentration in sectors worst hit by the pandemic. For instance, the Periodic Labor Force Survey 2018-19 pegged the female labor force participation rate at 18.6% in India. This figure is abysmally low. The pandemic has aggravated the crisis of an already declining female LFPR because females are more susceptible to layoffs and retrenchment during the lockdown. To take an illustration of the economic impact, a survey of around 2,500 domestic workers undertaken by Domestic Workers' Rights Union and 2 other organizations in Karnataka revealed that about 91% of them did not receive payment for the month of April 2020. Those being paid also faced a pay cut of around 50% or more. Around 87% of the workers were asked not to return to work until contacted again. Nearly half the workers above the age of 50 lost their jobs. In such circumstances, welfare measures such as cash transfers and universalization of the public distribution system became inevitable. Moving on, COVID-19 precautionary measures involve avoiding various forms of human contact through touch. However, tactile experiences are essential for survival for persons with disabilities. Women with visual or hearing impairment, physical, and many other forms of disabilities have been rendered helpless during the pandemic. A large number of disabled persons are marginal own account workers engaged in tasks which cannot be performed virtually, such as, say, street vending or running small shops. Thus, work from home isn't an option for them. During the pandemic, women migrant workers are at a greater risk of violence, both inside and outside the home. Self-isolation, home quarantine, or lockdown mandated confinement aggravates the risk of sexual and gender-based violence as well as intimate partner violence. The National Commission for Women reported the doubling of domestic violence complaints in the very first week of lockdown beginning late March. 1,600 distress calls were received from Delhi alone during March and April. The UN termed the 20% global increase in cases of domestic violence as a shadow pandemic. Women predominate in caregiving functions and roles such as that of frontline health workers. Yet, migration continues to have a male face. The plight of female migrants scarcely made it to mainstream news channels and popular media platforms. For example, a large number of garment factories in the states of Karnataka and Tamil Nadu employ young women aged 18 to 30 from the states of Odisha, West Bengal, Jharkhand, and Assam. They were forced to work in conditions of semi-bondage without adequate precautions. Their dues were not settled to prevent them from returning home. Under severe stress and agony, they kept waiting for travel arrangements to be made for them by the Odisha state government. It's quite difficult for single female migrants to return to their rural homes. Often, their families discourage them from returning because cities tend to offer a relatively higher wage. Safety is another concern for reasons that we have discussed earlier. Additionally, the lack of access to clean public toilets or sanitation facilities is a major hindrance, especially for menstruating, pregnant, lactating women, or those with infants and young children. This reiterates the significance of the women's right to the city. Perhaps the most battered section of female labor migrants is that of home-based workers. Nearly 1/5 of urban women workers are home-based. Once they are enumerated as marriage migrants, they are not considered economic migrants or workers. Most migrant workers tend to be deprived of welfare schemes owing to the lack of required documents and a bank account. Home-based workers are victims of both patriarchy and capitalism. The first does not allow them to work independently and assert their rights, while the other continues to exploit them for the extraction of surplus value. The loss of livelihood has further disempowered and disenfranchised migrant women. They expect financial assistance or an alternative employment opportunities from the state. Through its unplanned and mismanaged lockdown, the state has subjected its working people to hunger, hardships, and humiliation. It has abdicated its responsibility when welfare measures such as universalization of the PDS, cash transfers, rural as well as employment guarantee schemes should have been its first priority. In order to revive industries after the lockdown, several states have proposed amendments in the existing labor laws. Suspension of labor laws is not only an infringement upon the rights of workers, but it is also unconstitutional and a violation of several international labor standards. Besides being anti-welfare, these amendments are also gender insensitive. For instance, the increased working hours are set to impose a gender penalty upon women workers who are engaged in social reproduction and unpaid care work in the household after a 12-hour working day in the factory. Lack of enabling policies and support mechanisms also adversely affects various other sections of women, such as the elderly, the homeless, the disabled, sex workers, and trans women. The mantra of Atmanirbharta or self-reliance is another gimmick to divert the attention from the enormity of the ongoing and upcoming crisis. The poor have been left to fend for themselves. In conclusion, the ILO estimates that the COVID-19 pandemic shall take a toll on at least 25 million jobs worldwide, a majority of which are performed by women migrant workers in the informal economy. This paper argues that the predicament of female labor migrants has not garnered the attention that it deserves. As informal sector workers, they are not entitled to social insurance in any form, be it maternity benefits, death and disability insurance, or old age pensions. Active steps must be taken at this time to extend protection to all informal workers during these times of acute distress and uncertainty. The state, through its various institutions, should have ensured regular doorstep delivery of essential supplies, timely disbursal of disability pensions, alongside facilitating easy access to the public health system, especially for the disabled. Migration is not only a male problem. The obsession of several media houses with the viral has deviated them from their task of bringing ground realities to the light. They are responsible for propagating androcentric narratives and discourses surrounding migration. Further, by not questioning the state, they have failed as the fourth estate of democracy. The collective apathy of the state, employers, and the civil society, which includes you and me, has resulted in the pathetic conditions of women migrant workers. Women have been historically marginalized and discriminated against on the basis of gender, caste, race, religion, and many other intersectional identities. The pandemic has laid bare the structural inequalities and pushed women further away from the mainstream towards the margins, or maybe outside it. It has necessitated adequate representation of women in social dialogue for framing and implementing gender responsive macroeconomic policies. A democracy cannot thrive unless it strives for gender equality in every sphere. It is time for women to reclaim their rights and get their due. These are some of the references that I have referred to during the course of my research. And yes, thank you very much for your time and attention.
Perfect, absolutely perfect. Aishwarya, thank you very much. You stuck to your time. You've done exactly 11 minutes. So that's a really good job done, and your research is quite formidable. We'll ask you some questions after we finish. We now have Professor Setin. I think she's here. She will talk to us. You were talking about pandemic. She has a paper on the pandemic. So let's hear Professor Setin now. Thank you very much.
Thank you for this kind introduction. I would like to start by saying good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all the participants, panel participants here. There has been a slight change in my paper title, so it's now the impact of COVID-19 pandemic on political approaches in Europe. As we all know, COVID-19 pandemic has unfortunately been having tremendous repercussions at a global scale. Since the discovery of the first known cases in December 2019, it has been redefining the scope and scale of human mobility. While the pandemic has turned into a global crisis with transporter implications, countries also introduced new regulations and restrictions to limit and control human mobility, both across international and domestic borders. In addition, the pandemic is also having some implications on the political language used towards immigrants. On the one hand, new waves of anti-immigrant and xenophobic political discourses have emerged among some of the main migrant receiving countries in the global West, such as the United States. On the other hand, as the virus continues to affect the health of thousands of people, the role of health workers in some of these Western countries, where the majority of whom are immigrant origin, has started to be appreciated relatively more, such as in the UK. Another core dilemma that the West faces involves the existing economic interests which push for openness versus politics that push for closure of borders. With the COVID-19 pandemic, the clash between political competition and economic interests come to the fore once again. In this paper, I focus on the analysis of the political approaches towards immigrants in the post-COVID era in Europe, and I investigate whether there has been any drastic changes in the political references made to migrants, including refugees and asylum seekers. While doing that, I focus on the UK and Italy as particular examples. I selected the UK and Italy as relevant examples since immigration is a pressing issue in both countries, even though they have very different histories of immigration. In my paper, I argue that COVID-19 has been generating contrasting tendencies, while populist anti-immigrant political parties blame immigrants for spreading the virus. At the same time, the crucial role played by migrant healthcare workers has also come to the forefront, resulting in positive attitudes towards immigration to remain. I would like to elaborate a bit more on my key arguments before moving on to a more detailed discussion of my case studies. Western nations appear to be polarized on the issue of migration, and the COVID-19 pandemic revealed this polarization once again. The main divide appears to be between cosmopolitans and communitarians, or in other words, between those who favor free flow of capital, services, goods, persons, and international collaboration, and those who favor closed borders and put emphasis on the protection of national sovereignty and independence. Here, the core dilemma appears to be about balancing economic interests that push for openness versus political dynamics that push for closure. In other words, the way immigration debates develop within the context of political competition clash with economic interests in many of the Western countries, since immigrant labor is of crucial importance for the well-functioning of economies of these immigrant-receiving countries that are marked by aging populations. One of the most striking examples of this polarization over immigration was witnessed most recently during the Brexit debates. While the main messages developed by the so-called Leave side framed immigration by referring to control and regaining Britain's sovereignty to decide for the future of its national borders, Remain camp developed its messages by emphasizing the economic benefits arising from immigration. Even though differences of opinions and conflicts over an issue do not constitute a problem in itself, polarization as a component of politicization does, since it avoids having honest and open discussions about a matter. Recent research indicates that the COVID-19 crisis have led to a lessened attention on immigration within the political circles in Europe and reduced the issue salience of migration in general. Examining the puzzling development of reduced salience of immigration while far right is on the rise, Dennison and Geddes argue that even though there is opposition to migration among certain specific groups, more generally, attitudes to immigration become more favorable. While immigration reached a high peak of salience around the time of the so-called migration crisis in 2015 and 2016, since 2018, issues related to health and social security started to enjoy an increased salience. Irregular migration still remains an important point of public and political discussions taking place in the field of migration, and with COVID crisis, the issue of irregularity has acquired some increased relevance. The restricted mobility of irregular migrants in most of the European countries, and in particular, health issues that may arise due to detention and deportation conditions, together with homelessness problem among irregular migrants, constitute a particular element that have led to increased relevance of irregularity within the context of the pandemic. So I would like to now move on to a discussion of my case studies. And I would like to first of all start looking at the British case. Immigration is not a recent phenomenon for the UK, and the country has experienced migratory inflows for centuries. It's been receiving different types of migrant inflows, such as asylum seekers, labor migrants, students, the ones coming as part of family reunification. But the rising number of asylum applicants has become the center of public and media attention. The politicized approaches towards these groups led to the growth of public suspicion that not all the asylum claimants were really in need of asylum, but some were poorly skilled economic migrants making asylum claims to cover up their real intention to find alternative channels to come to the UK. In terms of how the key political parties approach immigration, immigration emerges as a highly politicized and securitized issue in British politics, and the political elites generally seek to attract votes by promising tougher and stricter immigration policies instead of promoting liberal approaches. Apart from that, economic benefits are somewhat recognized by, at least by the mainstream political parties, which indicate us that economic migration is dealt as a category of its own and receives more sympathy than the topic of asylum seeking. Finally, even though some links are established between immigration and issues such as creation of new health risks and environmental degradation, the amount of references made to these issues are few and appear to be developed only by certain political parties, in particular by anti-immigrant xenophobic parties such as British National Party. Yet the case of undocumented migrants is an exception here. A recently published report by the Kanlungan Filipino Consortium and human rights charity Refugee and Asylum Seeker Participatory Action Research indicate that the coronavirus pandemic has intensified the effects of the hostile environment on undocumented migrants in the UK. While the UK government says no charging or immigration checks will be carried out in the diagnosis or treatment of coronavirus, the same report highlights that most of the undocumented migrants are usually unaware of this and or they were put off by previous healthcare experiences. Now I would like to move on to my second case study, Italy. Unlike Britain, which is a traditional country of immigration, Italy turned into a country of immigration only during the 1970s. The initial migrant arrivals took place in the absence of any government-initiated labor migration program. Italian emigres returning to the motherland from Northern Europe during the 1970s constituted a substantial portion of this initial wave of arrivals. The lack of an active migrant labor recruitment channel, poor internal controls, and extended underground economy acted as the breeding ground for irregular immigration in Italy, which is the main point of concern in the country still as of today. Similar to the experiences in the UK, the rising numbers of both legal and undocumented immigrants started to become one of the main elements of the hostile immigration discourse used by anti-system parties such as the Northern League, Venetian League, Piemontese Union, etc. Therefore, even though Italy was a latecomer country to immigration, it was rather quick in terms of following the trend in Europe by adopting a restrictive political position towards immigration. With respect to the connections drawn between COVID-19 pandemic and migration, it should be noted that until February 2020, an implicit link was established between the movement of people and the spread of diseases. During March-May 2020 period, the migration emergency suddenly disappeared from the Italian public discourse. Nonetheless, since the start of the so-called phase 2 of the pandemic in Italy, meaning after 4th of May, it appears that the immigration crisis rhetoric is making a comeback. Some contradictory political positions are also displayed by populist political figures, such as the former Italian Minister of Interior, Salvini, who simultaneously complains about immigrants bringing COVID-19 to Italy and insists that the virus does not exist anymore, hence he won't wear a mask when entering the Senate building. This example reveals that when confronted with a real emergency, it is difficult for opportunistic political actors to maintain a coherent narrative on migration. I would like to wrap up my presentation by underlining that under the pressing reality of the COVID-19 pandemic, it's of crucial importance that the living and working conditions of asylum seekers and refugees, which make them more vulnerable to the virus, should be improved. Furthermore, it's at least equally important that the media and political discussions to be framed free of stigmatizing language towards asylum seekers and refugees. While in this paper, I argue that there was no evidence indicating increased salience of immigration within Italian and British political circles, we also need to face the reality that the exploitation of migrant workers is damaging and unsustainable for European societies as a whole. Certain measures have to be taken in order to avoid systematic discrimination of immigrants in general and asylum seekers and refugees in particular under the shadow of the ongoing pandemic. Among these measures, the most important one should involve taking systematic action to tackle the social, legal, and political determinants of the disproportionate and discriminative high risk of refugees and asylum seekers and other groups for contracting COVID-19, for suffering the disease and the socioeconomic consequences. Thank you very much for your attention and patience.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Setin, especially that you gave us such details about both the UK and the Italian situation. This really goes to show how Europe is reacting, and it's very unfortunate to hear from you that with COVID-19, the situation is only turning worse. And I'll have a question for you on that a little later, but let me just check, has by chance Victoria joined us by now, or she has not? And neither has Elizabeth. So I presume that we have none of the other presenters here.
Hi, here Victoria. I'm sorry, I'm appearing as Scott Chaplow. I'm in my husband's computer. That's why his name appeared, but I'm here. I'm ready to present.
Okay, please go right ahead then.
Okay.
Introduce yourself and go right ahead.
Okay. I would like to share a presentation. Can I or?
Yes, you can. Yes, you can.
I try, but says host disabled participant screen sharing.
Go to share screen. Go to share screen.
Yeah, I do that, but I think it's just for the co-host and.
Would Ani please help her?
I can start talking while we...
Yeah, please, you start. I'm working on it.
Okay, perfect. So, hello, good afternoon, Dr. Alwin Didar-Sain, chair of the session, fellow presenters, and participants from around the world, and good morning to our American colleagues in the American continent. My name is Victoria Castillo. I am an international migration specialist with a focus on migrant organizations, migration and development, human rights of migrants, labor, gender, and social inclusion. My paper and presentation today are based on my PhD dissertation, which I defended last year at the University of Geneva. The title of my presentation is Andean Migrant Associations, Host and Home Country Engagement. So I studied migrant associations from Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, and Bolivia in 2 cantons in Switzerland, Geneva Canton and Vaud Canton. So I have divided my presentation into 4 parts. The first one will focus on the research purpose and relevance. Then I will talk quickly about the Swiss context, then about the target population and the migrants in Switzerland. And then I will focus on Andean migrant associations in Switzerland. And then I will explain the results of my research on their host and home country engagement. So the paper and the presentation examine the objectives and main activities of Andean migrant associations in the canton of Geneva and Vaud, as I said, with the intention to understand the role in the integration process of members of those Andean migrant associations in the 2 cantons and their engagements in countries of origin. So migration is one of the most pressing issues nowadays, and despite restricted admission policies, people will continue to migrate, regular or irregularly. So what is important to focus is on how to integrate these populations to the host societies and how to facilitate their engagements with countries of origin. For that, migrant associations or diaspora organizations, migrant organizations, different names are used. For that, diaspora organizations in host countries can play a fundamental role. Migrant associations, diaspora organizations, might play a major role on the settlement process of migrants, in preserving their identity and culture, in supporting their interactions with the host community, and engaging collectively in countries of origin. So a little bit of information about the context in Switzerland. So Switzerland has one of the largest foreign-born populations in terms of share of migrants in its populations among the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development countries, OECD countries, after Luxembourg. That is.
Excuse me, can you please try again to share your screen?
Okay.
Yeah.
Yes, now it's possible. Okay, share.
Yes, done.
Let me see. Where is it? I cannot. Is it shared now?
Yes.
Okay.
You need to go to the bottom of the screen.
Yeah. I cannot see. Sorry.
You can click on slideshow and let the screen clear.
It doesn't appear here in my screen. Sorry.
Right at the bottom, you'll see a screen. Just click on that screen. Right at the bottom of the whole page.
Yeah, the thing is that I just see the. Hold on. I'm sorry.
Go to the bottom near Zoom, this minus plus, bottom right.
Or else just click on the second slide. You can come on the second slide. Just click on that.
Yes.
Yeah, but the thing is that it's not appearing in my screen. That's why I'm closing Windows to see. I'm so sorry. I will just probably.
Okay, forget it. You know the subject really well. Just carry on. You were giving a very, very interesting talk.
Yeah, I'm so sorry about that. I will come back to the points. So, yes. So, in Switzerland, so by December 2016, the foreign-born population permanently residing in Switzerland reached 2,029,000 people. That's, as I said before, 25% of the population. 69% is from the EU countries, and 31% is from third countries. While the Europeans have one type of policy to access the rights in Switzerland, the nationals from other countries, from third countries, just need to have a different law, and that is more restricted in terms of family reunifications, temporary and permanent residence. So the admissions procedure are harder. Regarding to under migrants in Switzerland, according to 2016 data, there are a good amount of, there are more or less 12,000 under migrants in Switzerland, excluding undocumented, naturalized, or Andean Spanish, because many Latin Americans have access to access to the Spanish citizenship, and then they can travel around Europe with them as Spanish. Colombian are the most numerous, followed by Peruvian, Ecuadorian, and Bolivian. Main destinations are Geneva, Vaud, and Zurich. Main drivers of migration at work, family reunification, marriage, and career advancement. It is a feminist-side migration flow. It's highly probable that an important proportion of the estimated 30,000 to 30,000 in Geneva and 12,000 in Vaud irregular migrants are from these 4 countries. So with regards to the migrant associations, I studied 12 under migrant associations. 7 associations were located in Geneva, 5 in Vaud. They specifically focus on acting at local level, at cantonal level. Given the migrant association characteristics, I divided them in 4 categories: cultural associations, awareness raising and information associations, solidarity associations, and scientific and academic associations. It is worth noting that the boundaries between the categories are blurred, as most of the associations engage in more than one of the categories, but they were categorized according to the primary focus. So with regards to their objectives, most of the under-migrant associations share the objective to valorize the identity, traditions, and culture of their countries of origin, and favor favor their members' integration process. 2 associations were focused specifically on academic and scientific work, and one of the associations was specifically working in the country of origin, Ecuador, to help vulnerable people in Ecuador. Some associations highlighted the importance of promoting unity among their migrants group. Others mentioned the relevance for them to play a bridge role between the migrant group and the host society, informing their members about how to then navigate the new society and assisting migrants in vulnerable situations. So with regards to the activities in host country, in this case, Switzerland, in the 2 cantons. So the under-migrant associations help the migrants to understand the host society. They provide advice and related support for employment and housing. With regards to employment, it is more like they tell the migrants, okay, you should go to this institution from the government that can have some information, or more like it works like network. So, okay, I know that in this part they need someone to do this work, and it works like that with regards to employment and housing too. They help introduce cultural practices specific to the host country for the migrants to adapt better. Disseminating relevant information in relation to migrant rights, provision of services, and institutions that offer those services. Also, they facilitate potential active citizenship in host societies through engaged participation within the association, because those associations in general work in partnership with NGOs or other civil society organizations that help migrants.
Victoria, please try and finish in 1 minute, please. Okay. Victoria, 1 minute, please.
Yes. And the migrant associations engagement in host countries is less important, and the migrant associations focus more in integration, really. But when they do activities in short term related to disaster relief, supporting long-term social services, and stimulating network, knowledge network, and sharing and transferring information from high-skilled migrants. So in conclusion, and the migrant associations in these two cantons have a basic level of transnationalism. They work mainly on integration, but they do some activities with regards to countries of origin, but the level is basic of transnationalism. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much to you, Victoria. You have shared with us your views on the whole Swiss environment and, well, sort of European environment, and how they are treating migrants, and you've raised some really important issues. I think it's time now that we take a few questions. I've looked at the chat box and I picked up a couple of questions from there. So I'm going to ask, the first one actually is about COVID deaths in the return migration or reverse migration that took place. And this is linked to another question that Thampi has also asked. He's asked about wage theft. Well, wage theft, I presume he means really in the migrants from the Gulf which are coming back to India. And there has been some wage theft there, whether ILO and international NGOs have handled this in some manner. So is there any of the panelists would like to take this question? Otherwise, Aishwarya, would you like to comment about the reverse migration and whether any country has paid compensation to this reverse migration that took place, particularly any deaths that took place?
Actually, I would like to begin. I mean, we are all aware what happened during our parliament session. So, I mean, the government is in a written response. The Union Labour Ministry said that there has been no data on migrant deaths, so no compensation would be provided. So that's the story here. Now, in different countries, I mean, I do not have data, so I would not like to talk about how this issue has been addressed, but there are two or three other related points that I would very quickly like to raise. So different countries have come up with different mechanisms for income support. And this would also try to look at the wage theft idea. So for instance, we have Ireland, where they have come up with something called a temporary wage subsidy. So and it is up to 70% of the workers' wages that are there. So the government has come up with this policy. In Germany, the Federal Employment Agency over there is covering 60% of the net loss of wages of all the workers. And if the employees or workers have children, then the Federal Employment Agency is covering up to 67% of the wage loss because of the pandemic.
Excellent.
And in fact, in the Netherlands, not only employed, but also the self-employed workers are eligible to apply for income support. So they've universalized the provision for income support. And in Spain also, what they have done is that any worker who's lost a job because of pandemic is treated as somebody who's met with an accident. So they have also expanded the ambit of protection of workers. So, I mean, whether it is isolation, illness, or restriction of movement due to COVID-19, they are treating them as a who suffered a work accident, and they're liable for the same welfare benefits. So they're also getting the social security benefits up to 75% of the last wage. So we have some lessons to learn maybe from some of the European countries where they've tried to make up for the loss of income because of the lockdown.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you very much, Aishwarya. That's really good data, and I'm sure it will be of use to some of the people both participating as well as the questionnaire that asked this very question. We have another question from Bacha Sarkar. This is really to Maria. To Maria, would you please like to answer this? You talked a lot about human rights and the whole situation in the US. The question to you was that what do you suggest are ways that can force these human research or human rights organizations to go back to their basics and actually do the job that they're supposed to do? It's an impossible question, but let's try and answer it.
So thank you. Yes, I think that this is a very relevant question for my research. And I think it's important to consider what was the Inter-American System on Human Rights initial objective. And the data that I analyzed and the literature review shows that the real goal was not the protection of human rights, but to use the system as a veil for the United States to be able to continue the interventionist agenda in Central American countries and somewhat in South American countries. So I think the question should be, do we need a regional system like that to protect the migrants of human rights of migrants? And I think that we also need to consider that migrants, when they migrate because of the things that they experience in their countries, are in a way taking agency and fighting for the protection of those human rights. So we need to find a system where we give the power back to migrants, where we acknowledge the agency of migrants, and maybe a system where the United States is not essential. We have 35 countries in the Americas, and we need to get all together and stop thinking that the United States is the only place where they can find safety. There are other countries that also can provide that safety. So in terms of going back to the objectives of the system, I don't think the initial objectives were positive, but I do think that there are things that we can do moving forward in order to give power back to the migrants and in order to just collaborate without thinking about the US as the only country to find safety.
Thank you very much, Myra. I think you've touched another chord, which is the Global Compact on Migration, because that does address certain aspects of human rights at a global level, and 164 countries did actually sign it. So we hope that something will happen, but there's more hope and less of reality in that statement. Okay, we have another question. I think I want to ask a question to Richa. Richa Shandola, you had talked about this whole business of the Japanese migrants to Brazil, and you talked about how when some of them returned back to Japan, they were given certain rights, at least to work and such like that. Can you compare that to the Indian PIO system and the Indian NRI system? Is that an overseas citizen of India OCI card kind of a situation? Does it work in some manner?
Well, I think I'm not so familiar with OCI and PIO, but what I think is, I think under PIO you have visa-free entry, or there are some leniencies given to these card holders. In Brazil also, the visa is called Taijushe. It was started in 1991. It's a multiple entry work visa. The only difference is, like, Indian diaspora usually uses their POI status to come to India to visit family. They might own land even at, or for other purposes. But the Taijushe visa specifically allows these Nikkei diaspora to take up temporary unskilled jobs in Japan. Now, Japan has a very restrictive visa regime, and they do not prefer, although they require labor, they don't prefer to accept migrant labor from, in the Indian subcontinent, for example, or other countries closer to them. But they want kind of a homogeneous society. That's why they encourage the Nikkei people to come back and work as temporary migrant labor. And in Japan, these workers are usually segregated to the secondary job market. So chances for them to get to work as professionals is very difficult. Although, let's say Japanese diaspora from America that comes to Japan, they may still have high paying jobs. But this Latin American diaspora, even with the use of the visa, mostly they are hired as contract labor. They don't even have similar benefits as Japanese citizens working in the same factory jobs. So the visa regime is basically to allow for the labor migration. It doesn't give other benefits to them.
Thank you very much, Richa. That's quite good. Yes, the Indian system was established really to give certain rights to persons of Indian origin. It was a kind of a replacement for a dual citizenship concept, which Japan also does not recognize, and neither does India.
But
And
Brazil recognizes
Brazil
actually dual.
does, but not Japan.
No, no.
No, not Japan. So this is a bit of a dichotomy there. Okay, I have a question for Professor Setin. You had talked about this whole business of COVID-19 and how it's impacted UK and Italy, and the situation is actually becoming worse. My question was that you have on the one hand the Global Compact on Migration, which you heard me refer to a little earlier, which has set the first global kind of context in which migration and migrants have some say in their performance, in their behavior, in their mobility, and all the rest of it. And straight you have a COVID-19 situation where most countries in Europe are actually closing their borders. How do you look at the dichotomy between these two?
Thank you very much for such an excellent question. In the paper, I touch upon this a bit without particularly talking about global compact, but I talk about the dichotomy between this economic need for migrant labor, and for also especially a need for populist politicians to push for borders by playing upon public anxiety, in particular by triggering public anxiety about the foreigners, about the unknown. So there's this competition between political interests and economic interests. And this dichotomy is actually quite easy to solve, but there's this lack of political willingness to address it, because some of the political parties gain votes by playing upon public anxiety, by playing upon people's fear about immigrants, and they don't hesitate to scapegoat immigrants. So we keep hearing such discourses as migrants are stealing jobs, migrants are competing against the native labor force, whereas in reality, most migrants take the jobs that are not wanted by the native labor force, or they take upon jobs that are left just lying there because of lack of qualifications on the side of the native labor force. So because of the way the issue of immigration has become a politicized and securitized issue, even the mainstream political actors are hesitant to talk about these points. Like Europe needs immigrants due to a lot of different reasons, starting with this ongoing need in their labor market, because populations are aging, and there isn't enough skill sets that can be basically found among members of the native community. So there is this need for immigration, there is the need for immigrants, but no one is willing to talk about this in an honest and open way, because these political actors are basically worried about losing their popularity. They are not actually coming up with long-term, even medium-term plans. So when the political logic is operating on the basis of short-term benefits, meaning gaining as many seats in the next elections as possible, that's how we end up with the so-called dichotomy. It's this, generated synthetic dichotomy, which could actually be easily addressed, which could easily be resolved, but it becomes a vicious circle because political actors do not have the willingness to address the ongoing needs, existing needs of European societies and European economies. I hope I've
Thank
said
you very
it.
much. Thank you very much, Professor Setin. But the fact that professors like you are still talking about it, there is some hope for the world. So keep on at it, keep doing your research, keep doing your papers, and keep telling the Europeans that they need to look at mobility if they need innovation and they want development in their society. So that is something which we all try to push. There is a business case for migration, and that needs to be flouted, and that needs to be pushed down the throat of many people who don't see the reality of what this is. Okay, I have a question for Arpana Tripathi, who talked about Singapore. You talked about all the Indian associations and the work that is happening there. My question to you, Arpana, was that is the Singapore example very unique? Can it only happen in Singapore, or do you think that this is being repeated by diasporas around the world in different countries? Thank you. Is Arpana available, or is she left the session now? Okay, Arpana seems to have left the session. We have some of the other panelists who are still here. I see Richa, I see Victoria, I see various other people. Are there any final comments that you'd like to make? Because we've got another 10-12 minutes to go. So would any of the panelists like to make any final comments? We can start with Victoria. Victoria, you talked about the whole Swiss situation. I'm told that in Switzerland they've handled COVID rather well. Is that true?
Well, there have been like everywhere, like 2 waves. There in Geneva, the numbers are quite high. In other parts of Switzerland, they're less. But I would like to comment with regards to COVID that migrant associations and the migrant associations have worked during not right now. Well, I haven't seen activities right now during this second wave, but during the first one, back in May, they were doing a lot of activities to collect food to give to Andean migrants, because many of these migrants, and especially the undocumented, work as domestic workers, or and they couldn't, because of the lockdown, they couldn't go and work, so they didn't have any income and no food to bring to their houses. So many of these Andes association work to collect food and give to these migrants in distress.
Thank you very much, Victoria. There's another suggestion and request to you, Victoria. Since your presentation couldn't be shown, is it possible to share your presentation with the organizers and they can make it available on their website or whatever, so that those interested can have a look at it? Thank you very much.
Sure, I will share it, of course.
Okay, Myra, Lawrence, would you like to have any final words?
No, so I think that just kind of like to close, it will be great to have an investigation where we explore how the different regional systems are working for each region, and then look at whether or not we do need those systems in place and whether they are being effective at protecting human rights systems. So if anyone is interested in doing that, a collaborative research project, I'm going to type my email on the chat and maybe we can work on that. But I do think that we need to start questioning this regional and global systems and whether or not they are being effective. Thank you.
Excellent idea, Myra. I am sure that you will find some of these wonderful researchers here like Richa, who's now going to talk about something to actually take you up on your offer, especially if your university has money. Okay, Richa, it's to you.
Yeah, especially for Myra, I'd like to say I'm in Latin American department, and we've been hearing a lot about the crisis of regionalism in Latin America, where it was very strong, but now I don't know, it's all unraveling. Even UNASUR, I think, is defunct now in a way. But regarding the Japanese-Brazilian migration, I forgot to mention two important aspects. First is the Nipo Brasileiro. They're the largest Japanese diaspora in the world. So Japan knows about this population. In fact, the Japanese government started building Japan houses in several countries. Sao Paulo was the first, and then it followed in Los Angeles and London as well. And now the population in Japan, the Nipo Brasileiro population in Japan, is the second largest Brazilian diaspora in the world. So this community is quite important to both countries, and a lot of interstate dialogue was also happened based on this community. And with relevance to COVID, what we find is, although a lot of most migration is now stopped, like after COVID, but what I find very interesting is that this labor migration is still being promoted. And in fact, two months back, I was finding a lot of advertisements by transnational recruitment agencies asking the Nipo Brasileiro who had most of them relocated back to Brazil when COVID first struck, but now they're being called back because of probably labor shortages in Japan. But not just that, it's just the strength of the networks, the transnational recruitment networks that keeps this migration going. So I'm sure despite COVID, just the networks that are formed by the migrants and their communities across borders, I'm sure migration will continue, like despite COVID.
Thank you, Richa. Mayurakshi Ganguly, would you like to say anything in terms of any final words?
No, thank you, sir. It was very enlightening, and I would really like to thank everyone for such beautiful presentations. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ms. Ganguly. Your colonial period linkage was very interesting, and I hope that, as I was mentioning to you, human rights, can we talk about human rights before and after independence and see whether there is a change in the whole migrant situation?
Yes,
Arpana, I was looking for Arpana. Arpana is not there. Ashwarya, would you like to have any final say?
Yes, I first of all thank you to the organizers. I think it's been wonderful listening to presentations from all over the world. And in terms of one final comment, I would like to raise probably this point that there is still a need to change perceptions because migration is still seen as a burden or as a problem. So last month, for 1 month, I was engaging with some undergraduate students of social sciences. When my effort at that time was to make them think about it differently. Is it about why migration is seen as a burden, saying a burden on resources or this or that, but I think this conference is a wonderful way to realize together about how we really need a borderless world and how it's so important for us in many, many ways to have new discussions on migration and see the many, many positives of it. So I think it's by this conference, we've actually initiated a lot of discussions around migration and sustainable development as well. So it's actually been wonderful. And I wish all the presenters all the very best for their research. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Aishwarya. Yes, you're absolutely right. Actually, this wonderful organization called GRFDT is doing a lot of good work. This is just one of their conferences. They've been doing a series of other presentations, and I find almost 200, 300 people taking part. It's quite phenomenal. It's suddenly migration has become a real global issue and people are listening to it. This is the dichotomy I was referring to. On the one hand, it's becoming so important, and on the other hand, everybody's closing up their borders. So it's a real it's a global issue. It's a human rights issue. It's a global issue. It's a development issue. So many other things are involved in it, and at some stage, we hope that. The world will see the writing on the wall and the benefits of it. So finally, we go to Professor Setin. Would you have anything as final words? We have another 3 minutes to go.
I also would like to thank the organizers and to you, our dear chair, for doing such a great job for ensuring the smooth operation of this panel and of this event, this conference. Thank you so much. As a final reflection, I would like to raise this point that governments should reconsider the detention conditions and release asylum seekers who are in closed detention facilities and apply the same measures used for nationals without discriminating them in order to ensure that these individuals are not infected and do not spread the virus. So governments should consider how any future treatments and vaccines will be rolled out. There's concern that non-nationals such as asylum seekers, refugees, migrants in general will not be sufficiently included in such a rollout with insufficient supplies. Besides ensuring equity from a human rights perspective, it makes public health sense to include all people according to a set criteria and not exclude certain groups due to nationality or other issues like religion or ethnicity. And I also would like to wish the best of luck to all the participants here with their ongoing and future research projects. Thank you very much once again.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Setin. You have also given us really good ideas and good views in terms of the situation as prevailing in Europe. And we do hope that, yes, as you're saying, that people do begin to see the importance of mobility. I have only one suggestion that I'd like to leave with all the researchers and all the participants here. In whatever research work you do, always bring an economic angle into it. The only thing that sells is business. So if you get your policy people, your governments, your political representatives, whoever they are, to realize that they will do better economically with encouraging migration, mobility, and diaspora, they will begin to see the importance of this as a human phenomena. I think just the fact of human rights and all that doesn't really work anymore. You have to really look at the business angle of it, and that really sells a story, which is something that the world is beginning and will want to especially buy now that COVID has destroyed economies around the world and everybody's looking to ways of improving on it. So thank you very much for all of your participation. Thank you for being here. Thanks again to GRFDT and all their partners for hosting us today. And thank you all for the participation. I think we finished just in time. And have a good evening or wherever you are, good morning or whatever it is that you're part of. Thank you very much and bye-bye.
Just a small announcement to
Yeah,
all
yes,
of
Ani,
you.
please, sorry, I'm sorry.
Yeah,
You have to give
but
the final words, yes.
yeah, before that, I would like to thank our dear chair, Dr. Didar Singh. You really made this as a wonderful session, and you helped with your recommendations. You helped our presenters to even generate new ideas regarding their topics. This was really wonderful. Thank you all. And just in the end, I would like to remind you that we have a special session on diaspora engagement, which is going to happen just after 15 minutes in this same room. So just don't leave the room. You can just take a short break and come back again. We have really good speakers on this session. So see you then. Have a great evening.
Thank you very much, Ani. Thank you to everybody else here. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
జయ ఇంకనే ఉన్నారా? సరే సరే, ఏం లేదమ్మా, పంతులు గారితో ఇప్పుడే మాట్లాడాను. ఈ రోజు చాలా మంచి రోజు అండి జయ. 11:50 మంచి ముహూర్తం ఉందంట. జయ మీకు కుదురుతుందిగా?
Please mute yourself, Dr. Bharati. Dr. Bharati, please mute yourself.
ఇప్పుడు వాటితో హెయిర్ ఆయిల్ 150 ml తో డాబర్ పేస్ట్ ఇస్తాను. స్పెషల్ పార్ట్నర్ ఈ పండుగ కాలాన్ని ఖజానా వారి ప్రత్యేక సంబరాలతో జరుపుకోండి. బంగారంపై గ్రాముకు 200 రూపాయలు తగ్గింపు, వస్త్రాలలో క్యారెట్కు 10,000 రూపాయలు తగ్గింపు. నేనే ఖజానా కొనండి. బాగా లేకుండా ఉన్నట్టుంది. అరే లేదు, ఈ బ్రీడ్ ఇలాగే ఉంటుంది, కొంచెం రాయల్ విశ్రాంతి